Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. Today we're here to talk about the fall garden. And I love the fall garden. One of the many reasons I love the fall garden is because it's a fresh start. Now this summer has had its share, or more than its share really, of gardening challenges. Here in Connecticut, it's been, I can't really say it's been hotter than usual because it normally gets as hot as it has been this summer, but it's been hotter for longer than usual and we have had almost no rain this summer. So it's been kind of a challenging summer. I find that actually most gardening seasons kind of come with their share of challenges. Just what the challenge is changes from year to year. But the point of this is that when you start planning for the fall garden, you're kind of starting fresh. And you know, the challenges of the summer garden, they're in the past. And now it's time to just start fresh and just start thinking about the fall garden. So I'm going to talk to you about the three kind of categories of plants that I plant in the fall garden, the three strategies that I use when planting my fall garden. But before we get into that, I just want to mention that this video is part of a collaboration. It's hosted by Cady over at Mayfield Ranch. I'm going to link her channel in the video description. Make sure you check out her channel. She's got lots of great gardening information, and she is gardening in a very different climate than I am. So if you watch my video and then go over and watch her video, you'll get some different information that could work for you depending on what area of the country you're in. She's also put together a playlist of other channels that are participating in this collab as well. So go ahead and watch all of those videos, and I know you're going to get some great information about starting your fall garden. Now, I mentioned when I'm planning my fall garden that there's kind of three categories or three strategies that I use with planting my fall garden. The first is frost tender plants that I want to get a second harvest out of. Now you can see behind me, I've got tomatoes here. These are my fall tomatoes. I have not gotten any harvest from these tomatoes yet. I'm growing these for fall, but these tomatoes are frost tender. That means as soon as we get our first frost, these plants are going to die. So when you're planting plants that you're hoping to get a harvest before frost, you really need to take into account your last frost date and count up how many days you have left before that frost date, and that will let you know what frost tender plants you have time to grow. And I'm going to show you a few plants that I'm growing that are not going to live through frost, like these tomatoes here. Now, do you see these tiny little seedlings here? These are cucumber seedlings, and these are also frost tender, like the tomatoes. Whenever we get a frost, these are going to die. So I am counting on being able to harvest some cucumbers from these plants before my first frost comes. Now, in my area in Connecticut, we usually get our first frost around October 15th. Could be earlier, could be later, depending on the season. You're going to want to know the estimated first frost date for your area before you decide what frost tender crops you're going to try to plant for fall. Those cucumber seedlings that I showed you, those have a really quick maturity date. Those I think are ready in an average of about 54 days. So that means 54 days from the time that I put the seed in the ground, I should be harvesting my first cucumber for those. That is a bit of a risk. I didn't actually write down what day I planted them, but it was probably about a week ago. So my 54 days started counting down about a week ago, which means I should now have about 47 days to go until my first cucumber. As I said, that's a bit of a risk. If my frost comes early, I'm not going to get to harvest anything from those cucumbers. But my frost may be late and I may get lots of cucumbers. In this case, I had lots of extra seeds from those cucumbers. I had a cucumber last year that I grew that was hiding under the foliage, and by the time I found it, it was like this big. You know, when you find a cucumber that big, it's not very good for eating. So what I decided to do was just let it go to full maturity and save seeds from it. So that's what I did, and so I have hundreds of those cucumber seeds. So for me, it's not that much of a risk to just put the seeds in the ground and see what happens. If the frost kills them, well, then I'm not really out anything. But if I get a harvest, then my risk pays off. As we go up the stairs to my deck here, you can see another cucumber plant that I have growing. This was kind of a late planted plant as well. So this should give me a succession sowing of cucumbers. And over here, you can see I have a butternut squash. This is again a bush butternut squash variety, which is why I'm able to plant it in a pot. It shouldn't take up that much space. And it's again a quick maturing butternut squash. I don't see any female flowers yet. We've had a few male flowers. But I'm hoping that we'll be able to get some harvest from this before fall. One thing to note about this plant is that it's planted in a pot, which means if it's really close to maturing before frost, but it's not quite there yet, I could bring it in overnight to protect it from frost and then bring it back out during the day. So that's another option. If you have a plant that's going to be fairly compact, plant it in a pot, and then you can bring it in your house to protect it from frost and bring it back out again once the weather's warm again. And then over here, I have some more sugar pie pumpkins. This is not a bush compact variety. You can see it's kind of trailing all across my deck. But I'm just gonna give this a try and see what happens. Now down in these pots back here, I have some second season tomatoes again. So these actually came from suckers on my plants out in the garden. I just clipped the suckers off and rooted them, and now I'm able to put them in pots. Now these are kind of a risk. This is definitely a risk because it's unlikely that these will mature before frost, but again, they're in pots and I can bring them into my house to get them through the worst of the frost. And these cost me literally nothing because I clipped them off my existing plants. These pots I was using for onions, but now I've harvested the onions, so I had the space. So I was like, well, I'm going to give these tomatoes a try and see what happens. And then over here, you can see another butternut squash plant growing. Over here, these are little cucumber seedlings coming up. Just ignore the carcasses of my dead brassicas that I was originally planting. That's a whole other story. But when that didn't work out, I planted some cucumbers in these pots. So you guys saw the cucumber seedlings that I planted directly out in my garden. I had kind of an issue with cucumbers this year. Something kept coming and nipping the tops off all of my plants, and I had to replant them so many times before I ever got some plants to take and to get a harvest from them. So I'm kind of hedging my bets this time. I planted some directly in the garden. I planted some more in pots on the deck. So we'll see what happens. As long as my frost is late enough this year, we should be pretty much guaranteed to get some fall cucumbers. Now over here, I've got kind of a new no-dig bed that I decided to go ahead and establish this year. I didn't decide to put this in. Okay, Milo's saying hi. Milo always needs to say hi when we're out here videoing. Say hi, Milo. So this garden here, I established well into the growing season, and so these plants have not yielded for me yet. You can see I've got a teepee of green beans here. These are actually rattlesnake pole beans, which are just starting to get their first blooms. So hopefully we'll have some beans from this soon. I've got some butternut squash here, which I'm not all that confident that I'm going to get a harvest from this before the season ends. This is a bush variety, which is why it's pretty small, and it's a very fast maturing variety. It's 75 days to maturity. At the time that I put this in, I had that much time left. It's kind of a risk. We're gonna see what happens. And over here, I've got sugar pie pumpkins. You can see these are starting to flower. So far, it's only had male flowers, but I'm hoping that we will get some of these before the frost comes. Again, this is a bit of a risk, but I feel like it's a risk that's not really going to cost me anything if I don't succeed. And if I do succeed, then I get the benefit of extra harvest. So as far as pumpkins go, these are pretty fast maturing. At the time that I put these in, I did have enough days left before my fall frost to get a harvest. So unless I get an early frost, I'll most likely get a harvest from these, but it's kind of a risk. And if you've been following along with me for a little while, you know that I think that in the garden, most risks are worth taking because they're not going to cost you much if they fail. And the potential reward is so much greater that I think it's really worth taking the risk. Now, in the case of this in-ground garden area here, it was kind of on the edge as to whether or not I'd be able to get a harvest before frost, but I figured why not go ahead and do it? The worst thing that can happen is I have this area prepped for next year and I don't get a harvest this year. And then next year I'll have this area all ready. I'll be able to plant in it earlier in the season and get a harvest. But as far as the fall garden goes, the big takeaway here is pay attention to your last frost date. So just go ahead and look up the last frost date for your area, see how much time you have left. And if you want to try something that's frost sensitive in your area, but you have enough days left in your growing season, go for it. Now, some examples of things that are great to try, frost sensitive crops that might be great to try depending on your area. Some cucumbers are very fast maturing. Summer squashes can be very fast maturing. Bush beans can be very fast maturing. Things like basil. All of those are things that are going to give you a harvest really fast, but they're not going to survive a frost. So go ahead and look at your growing season. And if you have enough days left in your growing season, go ahead and plan to give some of those plants a try. The worst thing that can happen is that you don't get a harvest, but you get a little bit of experience growing that plant and you're even more prepared for next year. Now, the second category of plants that you want to be thinking about, and these are the plants that most people think of the most when you think of a traditional fall garden, these are plants that can survive a light frost and keep going. So these plants, depending on your area, You'll be able to harvest them a little bit past the first frost. In my area, that means I'll be able to harvest them through October, through November, maybe even into December, depending on the plant and depending on the weather conditions that we get that year. These include plants that you mostly harvest the leaves from or the roots from, not as much plants that you harvest for the fruit. Some great examples of these kind of plants would be broccoli, cauliflower, kale, cabbage, all your brassicas, Brussels sprouts, lettuce. There's lots of Asian greens that are starting to become really popular now. There's spinach, arugula, carrots, rutabagas, turnips, all of those kind of plants will keep growing through the frost. Peas are a great example too. As long as your frost isn't too severe, as long as your weather conditions aren't too cold, and as long as you don't have a lot of snow or wind or other weather conditions that are going to really damage those plants will keep growing and you can harvest them well into the fall season. So I do have some of those going. Some of them I have started inside. I'll show you the little seedlings that I have started inside, mostly lettuces and greens. I've started some kale and cabbage and other plants directly out here in the garden. Some of them haven't even sprouted yet. I got off to a bit of a late start. You know, that's the thing with the fresh start that I was talking about before. I've had all kinds of things go wrong in the garden this year. I mean, you can see behind me, my tomatoes are getting diseased. I mean, there's just been all kinds of struggles in the garden this year. And so it is great to start fresh with new healthy plants. And in many ways, the fall gardening season is actually easier because you don't have to deal with the heat. Your plants aren't going to be getting dehydrated as easily because it's not so hot, it's not so sunny. There's a lot fewer pests in the fall. So in many ways, the fall is actually a really rewarding time to garden. Now, you can't grow after the first frost. You can't grow your heat-loving plants like tomatoes and peppers and beans and zucchini. So you're gonna kind of have to say goodbye to those for the summer. But there is so much available that you can grow even past the first frost. So just look at your area and your zone. I'm in zone 6. Your zone basically tells you how severe your winter is going to be, how cold your weather is going to get, or how cold it usually gets in your area. And that will tell you what plants you can kind of grow and keep growing as long as possible until it gets really too cold for them. A lot of those plants I don't really have a lot to show because they're just kind of getting started. I'll show you guys what my summer kale looks like. It's not great right now. It's very bug eaten. And so I am really excited for a fresh start with my kale. So you can see my kale here. We thankfully harvested a lot of this before this bug damage got really intense like it is. But the kale is really not doing well now. So what I'm actually going to do, I'm not going to pull out these plants. I did pull out a few of the really bad ones and give them to my chickens. They thought it was a great treat. But a lot of these other plants here, I'm going to keep going. And you can see in the middle here, these are still getting new fresh leaves. And these fresh leaves look pretty good. So if I can keep these alive long enough that we can kind of outlast the bugs and the weather gets too cold for the bugs, this kale will keep going and I'll get new harvest from the middle. So I'm going to keep this going, but I'm also starting new kale. So you can see I have some lettuce seedlings here. These admittedly don't look the best because we are in a pretty serious drought here in Connecticut and this lettuce isn't doing all that well. But once the temperatures really cool off, and if I'm able to stay consistent with watering these will really pick up once we're out of the hottest heat of summer, and this will give me some good lettuce harvest for the fall. Now the third category of plant that I really like to plant in the fall is actually pretty similar to a lot of plants in the second category. There's a lot of overlap there, but those are plants that I actually plan to keep alive the entire winter, if possible. If not the entire winter, then as long into the winter as I can. Now you'll see behind me, I have a mostly empty garden bed here, but I have these hoop supports set up. And I'm going to be using some season extension to try to keep a lot of these plants really going and healthy as long as possible. Now, a lot of these plants are going to be the same types of plants that I mentioned in the second category. A lot of lettuces, but you're going to want to make sure that you specifically look for winter lettuce or cold hardy lettuce. Exactly what's hardy in your area is going to depend on your area and your specific climate. But lettuces are a great choice. Spinaches, arugulas, a lot of your really tough greens. Carrots are a great choice. I'm planning to plant some new kale under these hoops that I'm going to try to keep going all winter long. I've got some really good Asian greens. I've got some tatsoi. I've got some pak choi. So when you have plants that are able to survive really cold temperatures, but they may not necessarily be able to survive certain weather conditions, like for example, heavy snow, heavy wind, just the kind of conditions that they're really going to get battered with as the winter goes on. So those are the types of plants that you may be able to keep going for all winter, or at least a good part of the winter with season extension. Now what I'm going to do with these hoop supports that I have here, when the weather starts to get cold and we're getting our first frost, I'm going to cover these with greenhouse plastic. I get a heavy duty plastic from the hardware store and cover them up. And then basically what's going to happen is it's going to work kind of like a mini greenhouse. Now it's not going to hold in a lot of heat. You're not going to be able to keep frost sensitive crops going in here, but what it will do is it will protect some of your frost hardy crops from the elements. What'll happen is during the day, it will heat up in there. The sun will come and will thaw out your frozen crops. So basically it'll protect your frost hardy crops from the worst of the winter weather. I'm going to do a separate video about season extension. I'm going to show you how I put up these hoops and the type of plants that I put under them, but that's going to be a separate video. I don't want to make this video too long today. So stay tuned for that. That's going to be coming soon. Probably, I want to say I'm probably going to show you that in October because that's when I'll be really getting these set up. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, just be looking for what plants can survive really cold conditions in your area. Probably talk to some local gardening friends, some local farmers, maybe join some local gardening Facebook pages and see what kind of plants people in your area are able to keep alive over the winter with some season extension. Now, even if you can't go the whole winter, if you can go through the end of December, that's going to give you a little extra food security and a little bit extra growing season, just save you a little bit of money on food. So even a little bit of season extension is something that can really help you out. All right, friends, thank you for hanging out with me today. I'm glad that I got to share my plans for the fall garden with you. That's about it for today, but I would love to hear your plans for your fall garden. Let me know the types of things that you're planning to grow this year or things that you've grown in the past and had success with. Let me know in the comments. So I look forward to sharing my fall garden with you as the season progresses. I can show you how my plants are doing. Hopefully it'll be a successful fall gardening season for all of us. So I look forward to seeing you soon and I hope you're having a great day. Talk to you later. Bye.